Good evening, welcome. I'd like to welcome you to our Annual Malford Thewlis Lecture on Gerontology and Geriatrics here at the University of Rhode Island. I'm Phil Clark. I'm the director of the Gerontology program and the Rhode Island Geriatric Education Center. We are so pleased that you are here to celebrate this lecture with us, especially this year. This is the 20th anniversary of the Malford Thewlis Lecture. The lecture was begun to highlight the important issues of the experience of aging and particularly policy and program issues involving older adults. In this spirit, we are particularly excited this year to focus on the importance of positive personal attributes and behaviors, such as kindness, gratitude, and optimism for health and longevity. The kind of person you are and what you do for other people make a difference. So at this point, we're going to ask everybody who's not kind or grateful or nice to please leave. I'd like, at this time, speaking of nice people, I want to thank our sponsors for this year's event, the URI Office of the Provost, the College of Health Sciences and its Department of Public Health, the URI Gerontology program, and the Rhode Island Geriatric Education Center. We especially want to draw your attention to the information available as you came in on the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. We would welcome your participation in the OLLI community of lifelong learners and the many programs that inspire older adults to keep learning. I'm curious, how many OLLI members are there tonight? We also ask you now to please turn off your phones and any other digital devices. I'd like to introduce Dr. Barbara Wolf, the president of the university, the provost of the University of Rhode Island, to bring greetings from the university. Provost Wolf.
Good evening and welcome to the University of Rhode Island. URI is pleased to offer this year's 20th Annual Thewlis Lecture focusing on how positive personal traits, attitudes, and behaviors can influence our health and longevity. We will start this evening with the URI's Land Acknowledgement Statement. The University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. We honor and respect the enduring and continuing relationship between the indigenous people and this land by teaching and learning more about their history and present-day communities, and by becoming stewards of the land we too inhabit. Thank you. This lecture represents a proud and long-standing tradition here at the University of Rhode Island and an opportunity each year to examine the many dimensions of aging. It is a topic of particular importance here in the Ocean State. Rhode Island is now a super aging state with more than 20% of our population aged 65 and older, a demographic shift that promises to have profound impacts on all of our lives. As a public flagship university, we see it as our responsibility to engage deeply with pressing social, economic, and policy issues like aging. URI is a member of the Age-Friendly University Global Network and reflects our commitment to integrating issues of aging and the experiences of older adults across our academic mission. We are advancing lifelong learning opportunities, fostering intergenerational programs, and supporting interdisciplinary research aimed at improving the health and well-being of older adults. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to the University of Rhode Island and thank you for joining us for this year's Thewlis Lecture, again, our 20th anniversary, so congratulations to all those who have made that happen. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening, and back to Phil, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Provost Wolf. I want to give people a bit of history by way of explaining why this lecture is called the Malford Thewlis Lecture on Gerontology and Geriatrics. Dr. Malford Thewlis was one of the key founders of the American Geriatric Society in New York City in 1942, the major U.S. professional association devoted to geriatric medicine. He was also the author of an early textbook on geriatrics, first published in 1919. Dr. Thewlis was also born in and a resident of Wakefield, Rhode Island. In the 1940s, he was a special consultant to the Rhode Island Department of Health and an attending physician at South County Hospital. We are delighted to have this annual lecture to commemorate the pioneering work of one of our esteemed neighbors. Now it gives me great pleasure to welcome our 2026 lecturer, Dr. Laura Kubansky. Dr. Kubansky is professor of social and behavioral sciences at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University. She received her PhD in social psychology from the University of Michigan and her MPH from Harvard, where she also completed a 2-year postdoc fellowship in social epidemiology. She has published extensively on the role of psychological and social factors in health, with a focus on stress and positive psychological assets, including emotional well-being. She is a principal or co-investigator on a wide variety of grants funded through the Veterans Administration, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the National Institutes of Health. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Kubansky.
Okay, so just to check, I have until about 6, is that right? Till about 6? Oh, sorry, till about 7. Till about 7, okay. I have till 6, so I'm going to go backwards. Yeah. All right, well, it is a pleasure to be here. And I've said to a few people what a joy it is to be in a room with so many people, you know, all interested in this topic. It's a captive audience, which is great. So I'm really, really delighted to be here and honored to be invited for this distinguished lecture. So I'm going to speak today about work I've been doing on the relationship between mental health and physical health in the realm of healthy aging, and some of the thinking we've been doing about strategies for improving your capacity to age in good health. And I want to say that a lot of these ideas are not new to me. They've been around. You can actually see references to them from the time of the Bible, from Aristotle and Hippocrates, and up through the ages. But for almost as long, they have actually been controversial. So I'll talk a little bit about why they've been controversial, and then where we are today with the state of knowledge, what I think we know, why I think this work is really important, and how I think it will help us to move forward to improve aging in society. So I'm going to start with, your provost already gave some statistics on this, which match really well with what I was going to mention, which is that we live in a world of aging population, and it's aging rapidly. So by 2050, the world's population aged 60 and older will be about 2 billion, which is up from 900 million in 2015, which is a significant demographic shift. And that's even accounting for COVID and some of the effects of COVID. The shifts in population aging started in the higher income countries, but you can now see that they're across all the countries, lower and middle income as well. This means that we'll have 1.5 billion people over the age of 65 by 2050, and perhaps even more striking is the number of people over 80. So if you look at the pale pink bars at the top of each bar, those are the number of people that are going to be over 80. So that's quite a significant shift. And while longer life brings all kinds of wonderful opportunities, and both for individuals and society, more time spent in physical and cognitive decline, if that's how those additional years are spent, is not what anybody is really looking for. So we want to be thinking about what are the factors that enable people to stay healthy for longer. And I just want to show, so the question we're going to really talk about is how many of these extra years are lived in good life, right? That's what, in good health. That's what we really want. We want any extra years we have should be lived as healthy as possible, so the time spent in illness and decline is as small or compressed as possible. This pattern of aging is visible certainly in the US, and as you said, in your own state. I'm sure you could find the same look here. You can see that from the chart that what was originally sort of a slightly more triangular shape in 2015 is becoming much more rectangular and square, suggesting that you've got people who are living longer. People are also having less children, which means you have a disproportionate growth of older age groups. And again, there's going to be a lot of implications for health systems and productivity and all kinds of aspects of society, particularly if those additional years of life are not spent in good health. So this is really a triumph of public health, right? The reason people are living longer is because of many public health successes. So things like vaccination and sanitation, improvements in maternal and child health. So we have public health to thank for this demographic shift. And in fact, age is the major risk factor for the majority of chronic diseases, right? So neurodegenerative disorders, cardiovascular disease, stroke, cancer, metabolic disease, and so on. So the approach up until now has largely been to try to reduce risk for diseases, right? That's the way we try to help people be healthier, is we look disease by disease and we try to reduce their risk for developing the disease and improve the health of the population that way. But that's a potentially inefficient way to improve health if you go disease by disease. And so recently you'll be hearing arguments that we need to focus not on longevity so much, but on health span and prevention. So health span is the concept of living long life in good health. So not just more years, but more years spent in good health. And research on health span changes the paradigm in biomedicine, because most of what biomedicine has focused on is trying to reduce risk, identify risk factors, mitigate problems, which is all really important, to be clear. But it hasn't so much looked at ways to maintain good health or to identify factors that may help you stay healthy, which might be different from the ones that reduce risk of specific diseases. So if you're thinking about health span, it's really a different paradigm and a different way of thinking. If you're trying to target the period of life that's spent in good health, where people are free from chronic diseases and disabilities linked with aging. So geroscience is a newish field that's been developing in part in response to understand health span and thinking about the biology of aging. So rather than looking at the endpoints of disease, it's sort of thinking about the biology of aging and developing ways of measuring how people age and targeting the biology of aging as a way to improve health rather than targeting specific diseases as a way to try to reduce risk of developing disease. And in fact, geroscience has been actively seeking solutions for slowing the rate of aging biologically, and there's a lot of excitement in the field about molecular solutions and pharmaceutical solutions, and these are all potentially very exciting, but at the moment, many folks consider them to still be a moonshot. On the other hand, we know a lot about factors that enable people to live longer and healthier right now today, and these are factors that are behavioral, that are from the physical environment, and that are also in the social and behavioral sciences. And so what I'm going to talk about today are some of what we know about factors, social and behavioral factors, that enable people to live longer in better health. So I'll talk about some of the exciting findings that we have in that space to say, it will be great if we can find these, molecular and pharmaceutical solutions for ways to slow the rate of aging, but we can do a lot right now without having to wait. So let's talk about some of those ideas. Okay, so as I mentioned, the notion that psychosocial factors matter for healthy aging has been around a really long time, and almost as long has been this debate about whether it's like a myth or it's true. So this is a quote from William Harvey, who's actually considered the father of cardiovascular medicine, who said, "A mental disturbance provoking pain, excessive joy, hope or anxiety extends to the heart, where it affects its temper and rate and impairs general nutrition and vigor." I actually love this quote. It has everything I care about in there. It has joy, it has anxiety, it has hope. It talks about the heart, where I've done a lot of work on cardiovascular disease. And this is from 1628. So, as I said, I didn't invent these ideas. I wish I could say I did. But so the question is, what's the controversy? Well, the American Heart Association still, to this day, does not think that stress, which is, lots of people think matters for health, is a risk factor for poor health. So the notion that stress affects health has been long accepted in the lay population. If I am traveling on an airplane and I sit next to someone and they say, "What do you do?" and I say, "Oh, I'm a researcher." "What do you study?" I say, "I study stress and health." Usually the next thing someone says is, "Oh, you should study me." At which point I'm always like, I don't know if I want the next story. And then after that, they're like, "Why do we have to study that? We already know this." So it's funny because, you talk to people on the street and they're pretty convinced that stress matters for health. But in biomedicine, there is a lot more skepticism. And that skepticism continues to this day. So this quote is from the American Heart Association very recently. And it's not just the American Heart Association. You will see this kind of sentiment on the Australian Heart Association and the British Heart Associations, which are the languages I read, so I've checked those. So the notion is stress matters, we don't think it's good, but it's not clear exactly why and how it matters, and we need more research to figure this out. So the reason this is potentially problematic is that if you don't think that stress is truly a risk factor or psychosocial factors really matter for health, we don't allocate resources, right, in our health system or our policies to address those factors. And if we don't allocate resources or systematically try to address those factors, then it means that we're not doing as good a job as we could do in promoting health if we thought they really mattered, right? So I can tell you, for example, just in the space of stress and health, which is sort of better accepted than some of the topics I'm going to talk about, even in medical schools or schools of public health, it is not required that anyone takes a course on stress and health. Some schools don't even have them, many actually. So while individual clinicians or public health practitioners may think that these factors matter, there's not systematic education about them, and similarly, there's not systematic efforts to address them. From various perspectives. So it matters a lot if the sort of power structures in biomedicine public health think that something is truly relevant for health. Okay, just to continue to make the point, if we think that people are skeptical about the notion that stress matters for health, well, they're even more skeptical about the notion that positive factors matter for health. I mean, this is the hypothesis they love to hate. Right? So this is a study that came out in The Lancet, which is a very high-powered medical journal that was testing the hypothesis that happiness would directly affect mortality. This is the notion that happier people live longer. And they did this work using data from the UK Million Women study. I do like to point out there were only about 700,000 women in the study for various reasons. They dropped 300,000 people. It's still a really big study, right? So they did this study. They said, well, you know, we don't really think happiness matters, but we're going to test the hypothesis. So they tested the hypothesis. They didn't have a very good measure of happiness. They had all kinds of issues methodologically, but in the end, what they concluded was, well, we don't think it matters. Basically, poor health makes people sad, right? And after you take account of the fact that poor health makes people unhappy, there was no relationship between happiness and subsequent longevity or mortality. So, you know, we took issue with the paper in part because we thought methodologically it was problematic, but this is just to give you an example of how this is not a well-accepted hypothesis, although I will say in the subsequent decade or so we've made a lot of progress. But it's still, you know, it's still not fully accepted. So I'm going to show you some of the work we've been doing on this to try to make the case and where we are with that. So I think we have established pretty definitively that psychological and social factors do impact aging processes. One set are psychological, so these are things like emotions, like anger and anxiety, related mental health conditions, thinking about things like depression or post-traumatic stress, which is severe anxiety that results from trauma exposure. Also thinking about social factors, so these are things like feeling a sense of belonging, feeling like you have community, being socially connected, right? So these are all factors that have been demonstrated to be related to aging processes. Now, as noted in this paper that I just showed you, the big concern is often here about bidirectionality, right? So I think people pretty well accept that feeling unwell makes you unhappy, and feeling unwell lowers your happiness. So nobody's really arguing that point. The point they're really arguing is whether directionality goes the other way. If I improve somebody's mental health, can I then improve their subsequent physical health? That's really the question that's at issue, and that's what I'm going to focus on for today, recognizing that there is bidirectionality in these relationships. So until recently, most of the research is focused on what we call a deficit model, right? Looking at kind of negative factors, so things like stress, depression, social isolation, those kinds of things. And that makes sense because when things go wrong, it captures our attention, right? It feels more urgent. And I have had people say to me, because I do study things like optimism and kindness, and I've had people say things to me like, well, that's fine, but shouldn't we alleviate suffering first? And I always say we should be worried about suffering. But are you sure that if you only study suffering, you will know all you can know about how to get beyond suffering, right? And maybe the goal isn't to just not be suffering. Maybe the goal is to be doing better than that. And if all you ever study is suffering versus not suffering, you may not know what you need to know in order to get to the next part of the continuum. So while I do think it's really important to take this deficit approach and to study these factors, I think it is also important to study the more positive factors. And this is what we call an asset-based approach, right? So having these kinds of behaviors and attributes and experiences are assets for health. And this really is a relatively newer way of thinking. It's a little bit of a paradigm change. It's thinking about things that enable people to be healthy and stay healthy, which might be different from the things that keep people from getting really, really sick, right? And you can imagine that, you know, one is not the same as the other. So, you know, I often give the example of if you have a child who is not being abused, that's good, right? We want that. But it's not the same as a child who's in a really nurturing environment, right? So if you just measure sort of being abused, not abused, you don't know how actually, what is that environment really, and are there factors in that environment that are going to enable the child to do really, really well? So this is sort of the distinction that we make. And some of the factors that we've been looking at most actively include optimism, acts of kindness. The jargon term for acts of kindness is prosociality, so you see that word occasionally. And it's basically looking out for others, I'll talk a little bit more about that, and having social connections. And I'll have to say, these ideas have been around for a long time. In fact, I teach a class on stress and health, and I just assigned my students one of the early articles written by one of the stress biologists. And he writes all this like detailed biology, really, really detailed, like, you know, corticotropin releasing hormone and all about cortisol and, you know, all these stress hormones. And after he writes, and these are all like, you know, rat studies, right? And like, you know, torturing the rats and making them run around and then dissecting them and so forth. So at the end of this whole article where he talks about that, he has these 2 paragraphs where he starts going on about how, you know, the things that really matter in life are work. People need to work. They need to have purpose. And you need to love your neighbor. I'm always like, wow, I don't know how I got that from the rats, you know? I think that's amazing. And what's really interesting, actually, if you read the literature on stress, is running through that literature, even in the most biologically sort of written papers, you will often see people kind of at the end of the article start to talk about some of these other factors. So it's just really interesting to see how people think about these things. But in any case, what I'm going to talk about today is whether psychosocial factors like stress and loneliness, optimism or acts of kindness, and social connections affect the way we age. And the research on this is highly interdisciplinary. It comes out of sociology and psychology in conjunction with epidemiology, nutrition, environmental health, and molecular biology. It is an amazingly interdisciplinary endeavor, which is one of the things that makes it a really exciting area to be in. And I'm going to show some of what we've learned in the next several slides. And I just want to take a minute. So this was the reason this has taken some time, I think, for the science to come along is because for a long time people thought it was soft science. Like, how do you measure feelings? You can't really do this in a systematic, quantifiable way, so we're not going to be able to look at it. And I just want to say, the evidence is coming along because we have now really good methods for doing this in a way that's quite rigorous and is beginning to convince the scientific community. So just a quick note, how do we measure psychological or social functioning? Most commonly we do this by questionnaire or self-report. There are other ways of doing. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk about that, but that's the most typical. Also most common, and the reason you see more research on this, is for people to measure distress and poor functioning. So it's until very recently, it was actually hard to find data that measured anything good. And I can tell you, even to this day, if you're trying to study kids, they never want to know about anything good. They always ask about kids who are struggling and what's happening, and it's very hard to find data that has measures of kids and good social environments. So it's getting a little better. So measures usually capture distressed versus not distressed, isolated and not isolated. So as I said, that's that lower half of the continuum of like not functioning well, right? But I think we're missing an important piece of the equation if we don't ask about positive functioning, right? Because there's going to be some insights that we're going to gain from understanding how positive functioning affects health that we can't find out if we only look at bad, not bad. So there's a whole science of measurement that we are able to leverage to be sure that we can do good measures when we do these studies. And then there's also a variety of study designs we can use to do this. Now, in medicine, biomedicine, public health, the gold standard study design is experimental methods. And this is where you essentially randomly assign people to be in one condition or the other, and then you apply the exposure, the thing that you're most interested in, to see if it affects the outcome. And the reason people like it is because the random assignment means that people are the same no matter which group they went to. So you know that if you see an effect, it's because of the one thing you changed, right? So that's what they call gold standard experimental methods. Well, this kind of work is really hard to do experimental methods with, right? You can't really randomize people to be lonely for 20 years and then follow them out for another 20 years to see who gets heart disease first, right? It's not feasible, and it's actually unethical, right? So you have to come up with other ways of doing these kinds of study designs. So the sort of next gold standard version of this work is to use observational data where you're not randomly assigning people, but you look at people's levels of loneliness or kindness or whatever it is, and you look at that when you know they're healthy, you measure those aspects, and then you follow them out for a long time to see who develops disease or who stays healthy. So these studies, when you include a measure of psychosocial well-being, you assess functioning when people are disease-free, and then you follow out to see who goes on to develop disease. You measure a whole lot of other things about them, so you can kind of account for those other pieces to make sure that the factor you're interested in really is the one that's driving the effective interest. And these are studies that run anywhere from 5 to 30 years. They typically have tens of thousands of people in them. So I told you about the UK Million Women study that only had 700,000 women in them, but they tend to be fairly large in order to try to see these effects in the population. So these are the methods that are most commonly used, and these are the methods that are going to be used for lots of the studies that I'm going to talk about now. But what I'll say is that in the recent past, we have had a gathering of evidence that is beginning to be increasingly compelling, and the strongest of it has been in the domain of cardiovascular disease, which is a little bit historical accident and a little bit because it's a really good model for this kind of work, which I can talk about if people are interested in. But it's also reassuring because cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of mortality. It's the leading reason for healthy life years that are lost. So it does give us a lot of insights about factors that influence healthy aging. And if you're interested in this work, the American Heart Association published this scientific statement. These scientific statements are very influential for the field. They often drive the direction of what funders are willing to think about and the kinds of guidelines and recommendations that the physicians are making and public health practitioners. So I was involved in writing the statement, and I was pretty excited about this, like a triumph that they were willing to even think about psychological factors as being relevant. Now, they didn't come right out and say, yes, we're going all in on these, but they did say there's an increasing appreciation, which I was like, okay, I'll take it, of how psychological health can contribute not only in a negative way to cardiovascular disease, but also in a positive way to better cardiovascular health. So I'm going to share a little bit of the evidence that sort of went into this. So one of the studies we did quite some time ago now was looking at the role of loneliness in risk of heart disease and whether lonely people were at greater risk of developing heart disease sooner in life. And this is a study we did in a nationally representative sample where we found that folks who were lonelier had a 76% higher risk of developing heart disease over about 20 years of follow-up. And this increased risk was evident even when we took account of things like education and family history of heart disease and a bunch of other risk factors. So we thought that it was pretty likely that loneliness really was having this effect. And of course, loneliness is a sense, just to be clear, it's a sense of sadness. It's a sense that I don't have company, I don't have friends. So it's a feeling, it's a subjective feeling state. And we all know people who seem to be surrounded by a lot of folks and yet somehow still feel lonely, right? And one of the questions that people are really thinking hard about now is what's the role of social media and digital interfaces in loneliness? Is it increasing loneliness? Is it decreasing loneliness? So there's lots of questions about that. But this has been relatively well accepted as a risk factor. The Surgeon General from the Biden administration, Dr. Vivek Murthy, came out with a statement about loneliness, basically arguing that loneliness is as bad for your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. They looked at some of the data and they looked at the risks imposed, and a lot of people find this surprising, but I think the evidence is actually pretty strong for this. And he basically argued that loneliness is like physical pain. It's a signal that like something you need for survival is not quite there. So that's some of the work on loneliness. That's just an example of some of those kinds of studies. This is from the paper that I mentioned, the summary article, the American Heart Association scientific statement, just showing a range of different kinds of distress that all seem to increase your risk of heart disease. So in a epidemiologic study, if you have a relative risk or a hazard ratio that's over 1, that says that you have that amount of excess risk for developing disease when you have high levels of that emotional factor, right? So for depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, social isolation and loneliness, excess risk increases anywhere from 19 to 71%. So that's a pretty sizable increase. I mean, the risk of smoking for heart disease is about 2x, so we're somewhere in that range depending on the risk factor. So that's pretty significant. Okay, so remember I said people are sort of like coming on board with the idea that stress and negative emotion matter, but this idea of positive emotion, like, not so sure, right? So is this fact or fiction? So we set out to kind of look at this and said, we're going to test this. We're going to take all these methods that are really rigorous and we're going to apply them in the same way, but we're going to look at the positive side. So, there's been this go back, sorry. There's been this long-standing idea, I think these are our Puritan roots, right? You will live a long and healthy life if you abstain from anything that brings you joy. I was like, really? Can that be right? It's very Puritan. All right. Or what if you experience and nourish joy? Now, the big sort of question in this area of work is whether if you see an effect, say, of joy or kindness or optimism, is it really different from the effect of the negative emotions, or do you just see it because someone who is more optimistic isn't depressed? It's really that depression matters, and so if they're optimistic, they're not depressed, but there's nothing additional that being optimistic or exhibiting kindness confers for health. So that's really been the question. It's less interesting to look at these positive factors if all they're doing is signaling the absence of something bad than if they actually confer benefit beyond just you're not depressed. So this is the kind of thing we've been trying to look at, and some of the strongest findings have come up in relation to optimism. And all of the studies that look at optimism, when they look at the role of optimism in health, always take account of depression because we're trying to make sure that it's more than just you're not depressed. And I like to say to my colleagues who do work on the other side, like, when you test whether depression is associated with higher risk of mortality or heart disease, I don't see you adjusting for optimism. How do you know depression isn't just the absence of optimism, right? So somehow they haven't really taken that on board, but we'll see. In any case, so all of the studies sort of try to say, over and above the effects of not being depressed, is there a benefit to having hope, looking forward, and so forth? So optimism is the expectation that positive things will occur in the future. And a question I often get about this work is, what about unrealistic optimism, right? The idea that I'm going to live forever, and so it's actually not good for my health. And I have to say, in the measures that we have of optimism, I've almost never seen that except with college students who sometimes seem to be thinking they're going to live forever. But certainly in the work in the older adults, it's not something, we've looked for this quite a bit and have never seen it. Anyway, just to run through some of this research, we had this hypothesis: higher optimism would be associated with greater likelihood of healthy aging, exceptional longevity. We did this work in 2 different cohorts of, one cohort was a little bit smaller with about, I don't know, it was like 15,000 people, and the other had 30,000 people, but quite a few folks. And what we found was that more optimistic people lived up to 15% longer. They had a 24% greater likelihood of aging in good health, which meant that they were free of disability, free of chronic diseases, and had healthy cognitive function. And in fact, they had a greater likelihood of living, of what we called exceptional longevity, was living to age 85 and older. So it really does seem to be health beneficial. And one of the things that's particularly interesting, and we took account of depression, we took account of other known risk factors, family history, hypertension, all these things, and we still see this effect. And the other thing that's been really encouraging about this, the finding has been replicated in many different cohorts. So it's not just this one study, it's been replicated in different racial and ethnic groups, different countries. So it seems to be a fairly robust finding. Now, if you look at other assets, like being more socially connected, you see some similar findings. So this is work we did with a group of women who are in the Nurses' Health Study, which is run out of Harvard. And we found that they were folks who were most socially integrated were 41% more likely to live to 85 or older. Again, exceptional longevity here. The nice thing about this finding is you can be socially connected in lots of different ways. There's not only one way to do it. So for instance, if you have a really good friend but you're not married, you seem to be just as protected as if you have a good marriage but maybe you have fewer friends, right? So there's lots of ways for social connections to have benefits. There's not only one path to, to good health that way. Okay, another one we've been interested in is these acts of kindness that I talked about. These are pro-social behaviors. So we were interested in whether people who engaged in more acts of kindness would have better health as well. This is some work we did using 35,000 adults in a study of UK adults who were followed for 10 years, and we looked at their chronic pain levels. And we looked at two acts of kindness. We looked at giving to charity and volunteering your time. And what we found was that people who gave to charity or volunteered their time were in lower pain, had reported less pain some years later. It was, I think, 10 years later. And if they did both, they reported even less pain. So that was pretty encouraging. So they had the lowest levels of chronic pain. So we have a lot of these studies now that find these linkages between these positive factors and better health. And then the question is, of course, how does this happen, right? What are the mechanisms that enable this activity that doesn't necessarily seem like it's health-linked to ultimately affect health? So there's a lot of thinking on this. I don't have time to go into it in too much detail, but just to say there's biological processes, there are decisions that people make that are influenced by levels of optimism, influenced by their capacity for kindness, and different behaviors that people engage in. I'm just going to show you one or two studies here. So we've looked at a lot of biological pathways. We've looked at inflammation. We've looked at lipid levels, looked at hypertension. One of the interesting advances has been the ability to look at the omics, like sort of look at the molecular level processes and try to see what's happening there. So we've been recently looking at the microbiome, which is really exciting. Microbiome is the gut health, right? There's a lot of bacteria that live in your gut. You can have a healthier bacteria profile or a less healthy profile. And the gut and the brain seem to talk to each other quite a bit. And a lot of the work has been done with depression, but we've started doing this work looking at whether people who are more optimistic or have a greater sense of emotional well-being will have healthier guts. And so this is some work that we just recently published where we found that this was the case. People with higher levels of purpose, higher sense of emotional well-being had more diversity of bacteria in their gut, which is considered a marker of good health, and they had less bacteria that were linked with other poor health outcomes. So that's been kind of exciting. You can also see effects on behavior. This is some work I didn't do, although I love this study. So this is data from a large clinical trial with women, and they were looking at whether they could get women to eat a healthier diet. They were doing an intervention on diet, and they weren't very interested in optimism, but they happened to measure it, so we took a look at it. And what you see, what's really interesting here is in the chart on the, let's see, it's on your left, at baseline, the more optimistic women, so they're in the dark red, the people with the high levels of optimism, had healthier eating score. They were eating healthier at baseline, so before anything ever happened. So that's fine, maybe not super surprising, but when they looked at change in healthy eating after the intervention was administered, after they did a whole trial to see if they could get women to eat more healthily, they found that the dark red, the women who were the most optimistic, were the most likely to take up the intervention recommendations and then have a healthier eating. So it seems like optimism enables people to engage in better health behaviors for a variety of reasons. So that's been some really interesting work to follow as well. All right, so here's the big question, and I just have to say Shakespeare says it better than I do. So I'm going to read his quote. "Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased, pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow, raise out the written troubles of the brain, and with some sweet oblivious antidote, cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff which weighs upon the heart. I mean, really. We scientists, like, not as interesting. The really boring way to say this is like, okay, can we change, can the health effects be altered if we modify psychosocial factors? So if I change how you're functioning psychosocially, can I improve your health outcomes, right? That's the boring way to say it. Now, the big question is, are these psychosocial factors modifiable? Sometimes people will say, well, isn't optimism and sense of purpose, aren't these pretty well genetically determined? And the truth is they're about 25 to 30% heritable, so partly, but that means there's a lot of room for other factors to influence and shape people's levels on these attributes and behaviors. And so the research shows pretty convincingly that these are in fact modifiable. And if that's the case, then the question is, if we modify, if we are able to help people to be more hopeful, more optimistic, kinder, can we improve their subsequent physical health outcomes? So it's good for mental health regardless, right? But then the question for us is, can we then improve their physical health? So this is some of the questions we've also been trying to figure out. And the data on this are still a little bit limited. We have some encouraging findings that I'll just show you really quickly. So we did a study looking at post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm back on the dark side for a minute because that's where the data are. And we were asking the question of whether, okay, we know that post-traumatic stress increases risk of developing heart disease. I showed you that in the chart with all the summary of the data from the article we wrote. So we know it increases risk of heart disease. If we treat post-traumatic stress and we're able to help people, be less distressed, does that change their subsequent risk of heart disease? That was the question we were asking. So this is what we looked at. Again, we had about 54,000 women in a study that we've been doing at Harvard for many years. And we had measures of post-traumatic stress, and we also knew if the post-traumatic stress remitted. So what I want you to see here is we were comparing the risk of women with post-traumatic stress to people who had never experienced any traumatic events, never experienced a significant major stressor, which is part of the diagnosis of PTSD. And then we looked at the women who still had severe PTSD symptoms and those who remitted. And that's what I'm showing here. So compared to the women who didn't experience any trauma, there were 220% higher odds of developing heart disease among the women with active PTSD, but there was no excess risk among the women whose PTSD remitted. So this is, there's some caveats we can make about, these data and the findings, but I took this as very good news, like very heartening. If we can improve psychosocial functioning, we can also improve downstream physical health, which from a healthy aging perspective is really promising. So that leads us to this question, right? Can we engineer longer health spans through psychosocial interventions, right? This is the multi-million-dollar question. I used to say 64,000, but that just seems so 20, whatever, 1900, I don't know, so last century. Anyway, the question is, can we improve healthy aging by intervening on upstream social and environmental factors? So the science here is early, but it's promising. I'm just going to show you a little bit of the work that is beginning to engage with some of these questions. So the evidence suggests we can modify psychosocial functioning. It's not always easy, I want to say. Like, it's not like you just take a pill and you feel great, right? I mean, it takes some work. And I'm happy to say, by the way, I think, is it OLLI? Is that how you call your lifelong learning? This is one of the ways of actually maintaining really good psychosocial functioning. It's so exciting. So that all these people are doing this, which is great. So that is actually one of the interventions that's possible. But there's a variety of interventions you can do, ranging from very individual level to slightly more community-based, right? But there's medication for people who are really, really distressed. There are patient programs for people who are already struggling with illness, and cardiac rehab is a good example of this. There's counseling one-on-one. These are all very useful, but from a population perspective, they're not terribly efficient, right? It's going to be tough to do this at a population level. People talk about writing exercises, so you count blessings, you engage in gratitude letters, pro-social activities, which is the one I've been really interested in recently. We'll come back to that. And I'm sure everyone's heard about mindfulness and meditation programs as also being a way to improve psychosocial functioning. At the population level or the community level, there are other interventions that people have been thinking a lot about. So there are interventions that people have implemented in schools, in places, in faith-based places. There's also a lot of thinking about workplaces as a determinant of health and trying to change the work conditions to make people, give people more opportunities to be healthy. So this is different from saying, giving workers a meditation program and asking them to just meditate if they have a toxic boss, which I always think is a little bit problematic. This is like changing the actual conditions of the work, right? Giving people more flexibility in their work or having better supervisor support. It's actually changing the conditions of work to enable people to function better. Another one I've been really interested in, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but there's a lot of research now on arts interventions and arts involvement in improving health and well-being, and I think that's a really promising area for additional research, as well as exposure to nature and natural environments. These are some of the interventions now that people are really looking at carefully and thinking about how they work. I'm just going to give you an example of some of the stuff that I've been more involved in, which is the pro-sociality, so the acts of kindness and interventions to show you that these interventions really do seem to have an important effect, not just on psychosocial functioning, but also on physical health. And in fact, we decided this was so important, and I was speaking this one earlier just before I came up here, and I was saying the world needs more kindness, right? Like, really, the world needs more kindness. But from a public health perspective, in terms of what enables both individuals and societies to be healthy, we've started believing like pro-sociality should be a public health priority. It's kind of the trifecta, right? So the idea with pro-sociality is we used to think like the most important thing was to be loved and to receive support, which is really important. But it turns out that the research shows us that actually giving love and giving support is as good, if not better, for my health. I give, and is better for my health. But I think of it as a trifecta because I give support or I give love, and it's better for my health. But it's also better for the person who is getting it, presumably, right? Something good. And it's better for society. This is where I get the trifecta, right? So we wrote a whole opinion piece on the idea that we're missing an opportunity for improving health at the population level. You can see this most clearly in the context of COVID, right? So it is an act of kindness in some ways to wear a mask because, I mean, while you are protecting yourself, you are protecting other people as well. And the same with getting vaccinated. And it also creates a healthier community. But I think this goes well beyond just infectious disease. So, okay. So I want to tell you about a study that I wish I had done, but I can't take credit for, called the Baltimore Experience Course Study. I don't know how many, has anyone here ever heard of it? It's a really wonderful study. So this was a experiment, actually. It was an experimental trial where they had 702 volunteers who were 60 years or older. And they were randomized. Remember I said they got randomly assigned, right? Some people got assigned to volunteer for 2 years, and some people got assigned to just do whatever they were doing otherwise. And the reason that random assignment is important is because it kind of shuffles any other differences that you might have between those people. So those groups, when you compare them and you say, did volunteering make a difference, you're pretty sure that that's the thing that really matters. So the assignment was to help school children, reading, literacy, math, behavior support, using library resources. They did this for 15 hours a week for 2 full school years. And then they looked at a series of outcomes. They looked at physical functioning, disability, mobility. They looked at cognitive functioning, memory and executive function. And they looked at psychosocial functioning. And the results were really striking on lots of domains, and they're still publishing work in this area. And in fact, they're still following those adults for now looking at things like dementia and cardiovascular disease and some of these other outcomes. But they already found improvements in memory, in whole brain volume and in hippocampal volume. And these findings were really striking. So what I'm showing you here is just a graph that shows, so as people age, they tend to lose brain volume, and that's why sometimes the memory declines. But the program participation among the volunteers, they had a much slower rate of decline in the brain volume. And in fact, the argument was that it was like a 3-year reversal in brain aging, which is kind of astounding if you think about it, right? So this notion is that like volunteering reshapes your brain. So everyone's going to run out and volunteer now because it's so great. But I mean, I find these findings quite striking and very compelling because the study design is sort of gold standard, very rigorous, and the findings have now been replicated. And this is actionable, right? We can create incentives to help people be more willing to volunteer. We can create more programming for it, right? This is something we could do as a society that would, have a big effect for lots of reasons. But this changes in the 3-year, reversing brain aging, I think is quite striking. Okay, the other one I'll just mention really briefly is the promise of nature-based interventions. There have now been a number of studies trying to see if I assign people to go spend more time in nature, do I see improvements in mental health and subsequent physical health? So this was a study that did a summary of about 50 studies testing this hypothesis that if I ask people to spend more time in nature, they will show improvements in psychosocial functioning and ultimately in physical health. And essentially what the study suggested is that, in fact, spending more time in nature will improve psychosocial functioning, it improves attention, it reduces anxiety, it increases capacity for hope, which is really great. And in the UK, actually, where they have this wonderful thing of universal health insurance, which is so great. And they do something called social prescribing, which is where they'll prescribe things that are not necessarily medicine. Well, one of the things they prescribe is nature. And the finding, and they don't just prescribe it like your doctor's like, hey, it would be really good if you spend some time in nature. And you're like, okay, I don't know how I'm going to get there. And there's a lot of bugs out there and whatever. What they do in the UK when they make these prescriptions is they try to help you find ways to do it that work for you. So maybe you need some transportation to get to the park, or you might need someone to go with. So it's not just like a recommendation, it's an actual sort of program to make sure that people really can do this. And when they look at the data, they do find that folks who've been prescribed, socially prescribed to spend time in nature, do seem to be doing better. So there's a lot of hope for some of these interventions that are also not like taking things away from people, which is also nice. It's sort of a, gives something to people and something that creates joy. Not only helps with psychosocial functioning, but also may have really significant impacts on subsequent physical health. So I think there's a lot of really exciting work that people are doing in this area. There's still more to do. There's always more to do. But just to summarize briefly where we are, I hope what I've left you with today is that both positive and negative aspects of psychosocial functioning matter for healthy aging. So we certainly do want to reduce suffering. We certainly do want to address things like loneliness and anxiety and depression. But I think we shouldn't stop there, and I think we can do better. And so we can think about how do we help people to have more hope for the future, be more optimistic, engage in more kindness, have a greater sense of purpose. And the other thing, I talked a little bit less about this, so you can just take my word for it for now, but these studies really carefully try to make the case that the presence of the positive factor gives you something more on the health side than just taking away the negative. So just being not depressed is not the same as being joyful. And being actively joyful does seem to confer additional health benefits. So that's another really important lesson we've been learning from this work. I hope that this work will encourage, policymakers and practitioners and individuals to invest in ways to increase capacity to engage in acts of kindness, to give people more reasons to have hope and optimism, to be socially connected, to feel a sense of belonging in the population. And with this, we'll build a really strong science for healthy aging. Again, considering both deficits but also assets. And then we can develop new targets for prevention and intervention and consider all these relationships in the context of social and physical environments. And in my last 30 seconds, I'm going to make a shameless plug for a new initiative we have at Harvard in case anyone is interested on healthy aging. And this is really, really exciting. It's what I call a cells to society approach. My colleague, William Mayer, works on C. elegans, that's the green worm, as a model of longevity. And my most favorite, that weird-looking creature there, I don't know if anyone knows what that is. It's a tardigrade. It's my most favorite organism. It is the most resilient organism known anywhere. They are phenomenally resilient, and I keep thinking if we could understand what the elements of resilience are, we could capture that and use it for human life and longevity. And then, of course, all the psychosocial factors. So the goal of the Aging Initiative is to extend human health span with a cells to society approach, thinking not only about geroscience and biological aging, and some of the molecular factors there, but also all the way up through psychosocial and societal factors to understand how we keep people healthy for longer. This is what we call the longevity dividend. So if we intervene on the aging process, not waiting until people are sick, we can reduce the amount of time people spend in really unhealthy, unfun states. There's a term for this called compression of morbidity. And we extend the time spent in healthy states. So the idea would be that every minute of what you live is in good health until the very last, 30 seconds, right? That's the ideal. Or maybe 20. And so we are looking at all kinds of ways of decelerating aging, looking at social integration, geroprotectors, healthy diet, sleep, all of these things, as well as looking at understanding how to reduce things that accelerate aging. So, overweight, stress, and these kinds of things. So that's the program. We're just getting off the ground at Harvard. Happy to talk to people more if it's interesting. And I just want to end by saying I could not do this. This work is done with so many amazing collaborators. It is one of the joys of doing this work. And I mean, fellow faculty and scholars, and so many students and trainees who have gone on to do amazing, amazing work. So that is a real joy. Also, the study participants are amazing. They fill out the questionnaires. They send us poop samples. They give us hair samples. I mean, it's amazing what people are willing to do, which is just such a gift to the world. And I just have to share this one thing. I woke up one night in the middle of the night and I was like, because we've been doing this work on pro-sociality, right? I've been doing work on volunteering, and in the studies we do, we compare the people who volunteer, right, and look at their health to the people in our study who aren't reporting that they're volunteering any hours. And I woke up in the middle of the night one night and I was like, oh no, anyone who participates in a study is doing something pro-social. They are giving us the gift of their time and their information. I was like, can I even do this with these data? I mean, it was really a moment of, uh-oh. I think I figured it out, but it did keep me up for a while. Anyway, so we are so grateful to all the study participants who make this work possible, and then, of course, to the funders who have been very generous with funding this work. So, and thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions, or I don't know, Phil, if you have a... Oh, we're going to sit. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Is this on? Yeah. So we have a few minutes for questions, comments, people sharing your experience along the way of some of the topics that we've been talking about. So there's a hand up down here, yes.
Yes, you showed a picture of a critter, a creature that was your favorite animal, and I was trying to figure out what it was. It looked like a possum, but it also looked like a walrus. What was that?
It's a tardigrade, also known as a water bear. It's a very tiny organism, and it's incredibly resilient. You can send it to the moon, and it will hibernate, and it comes back, and it reforms itself. It's pretty amazing, but it's very, very tiny.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a microorganism.
The role of pets is very important to me in aging. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think there's an increasing amount of research that suggests that pets can be very important for health. And there's lots of interesting reasons for that, right? So one is companionship, right? And the other is essentially taking care of other, right? We've just talked about how valuable that is. And feeling responsible for another creature. And of course, there's the unconditional love that, well, I mean, I don't know if you get unconditional love from like a snake, but I'm thinking more like on dogs and cats, right? Unconditional, right? I mean, you come home and every day they just think it's so great you're there again, like they're never tired of it, which is great. And then, there's some sort of more, biochemical things too that may be at play. But I think the research is pretty suggestive that having pets can be, quite good. And in fact, there are some funny studies where, they had women come into the lab and they either came with their pet or they came with their husband, and their levels of stress were lower when they came with the pet. And when I don't know, you make what you want of that one, but,
I think we have a question down here, yes.
Yeah, you might have sort of hinted at the answer to this question, but I noticed I didn't see anything really about family, and I know that there's been studies about longevity and family, being with family, and then there's...
Yes, family is complicated. And in fact, a lot of the work looking at family is often done in the context of caregiving. And caregiving is an interesting issue because in some ways of thinking about it, caregiving is a pro-social act, right? It is taking care of other in a really generous way. But if it's perceived as very burdensome, then it may not be health beneficial. So the research has really struggled with sort of trying to characterize that appropriately. There's no question that marriage, particularly for men, is pretty good for your health. The data are, the quality of marriage matters a lot, for sure. But just being married for men seems to be really good for their health. So there's that. The other thing that I think has been less explored but is really interesting, I actually have a trainee right now, a doctoral student, who just published a paper who's really interested in relationships in general and family and how it affects health and some of the spillover effects, right? So in the paper he just did, he looked at whether having a depressed spouse is bad for the other spouse's health. So depression is bad for the person's health, we know that, but what happens for the partner's health? And it turns out that, if you have a depressed spouse, you're I don't know if I should say this out loud, but I don't know how many people, but it's less good for your health too. So there's both good and bad. Right now, people have not looked at if I have a super optimistic, happy spouse, right? Does that do better? I would imagine it does, but no one has looked at it, right? Because people always look at the bad stuff first. Yeah, right. I'll send you a note. Yeah, absolutely. So I do, yes, family is important. It is relatively less studied in epidemiology in these fields, but actually I will say I think it's kind of about to have a moment. I literally have 3 students in our program who are suddenly like, this is the thing they all want to look at, and I was like, this is so weird. And in the last 2 decades, I've had exactly 1 student who wanted to look at it, and now all of a sudden I have 3 at the same time. So I think it's a rising interest.
Questions over here? Oh, okay, right here in the middle, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Dr. Kubansky. This was fantastic. I love the whole thing about focusing on the positive as opposed to ultra-focusing on the negative. But I was going to just point out one thing. I think it's still important to be cautious about the directionality because you have certainly looked at, and with others in your own research, a large number of people, and that helps a great deal in making a point. And you've also looked at relationships. If this relates to this, that's a very big thing. And even longevity, it seems like, and ruling out some factors. So you have ruled out possible confounds, but it's still not 100% clear if being happy will make you healthier or if being healthier just makes you happier.
Right.
So what I'm hopeful for is that a lot of your research and others is helping fund this more proactive experimental thing where you volunteer people randomly assigned to volunteer versus not. That helps establish the direction. But I think we still need to be cautious about saying this causes an effect when you don't know for certain if this is the leading factor and this is the outcome. All that said, I love it. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, to your point, correlation is not causation, and all of the observational studies are correlational. Now, we certainly do absolutely everything we can to rule out concerns about reverse causality. So we take out anyone from the sample who has any serious health problems, right? If we're studying heart disease, we take out anyone who has heart disease. When we take account of family history, we account for hypertension, we account for high cholesterol, we account for diabetes, right? We take account of all of those things so that we can try to rule out that there's some underlying health issue, right, that is making them both happier and having better health 20 years down the road. We have tried to address this also in work I didn't talk about here today, where we look at kids and we look at how likely these factors are in children to predict adult health, because with kids, they're generally pretty healthy, and so you're less worried that they have subdromal heart disease when you've measured these factors. We do have some really interesting data where it's actually a really fun study where these kids in the UK were invited to write an essay at age 11 about what they thought their life was going to be when they were 25. These things are like so funny. They're like, I'm going to ride a unicorn to work every day. I mean, some of them were hilarious. Anyway, we coded those for psychosocial well-being at age 11, and then we looked at whether that predicted cardiometabolic disease when they were in their 50s. And it was protective. But again, it's still correlational, but at least you have childhood, so you're a little less worried about reverse causality. There is some experimental work there's a lot of experimental work that looks at if I induce happiness, do I reduce immediate levels of, blood pressure? Or can I reduce inflammation? There's a lot of that kind of work that I didn't go into today. So if you're willing to take studies from lots of different places, you begin to have a confluence of evidence, but it's true that there's no perfect study. The only other thing I'll say on that point is we never did the experiment with smoking, right? We never randomized people to smoke and not smoke and then said, okay, it causes lung disease or heart disease, and we did still decide that it was causally related. So agree that caution is absolutely important to use, and I don't think we're there. I don't think we have the level of evidence, for the optimism and kindness that we did for smoking, but I also think that, it's possible to get there.
Questions? A few questions down here, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Enjoyed your presentation. I noticed that most of the studies that you cited seem to be studies that were done with women only. Can you comment on why that is and whether there's a particular gender bias
In my
one
work?
way or another in the result?
Yeah, so it's funny you say that because it is true, and part of the reason is opportunistic, because the data sets that I'm most closely tied to are studies of women. Now that's partly because for years and years and years, women weren't studied at all. And so, just before I sort of got into the field, they started a couple of really big studies of women to try to make up the gap. So it is true that a lot of the work that I happen to cite are studies of women, because those are the data that I work with, and I'm particularly interested in women's health. Having said that, all of the work I've shown you has been replicated in men. So it isn't, and in fact, some of the data were also in men and women. So the studies on optimism and healthy aging and exceptional longevity were done in both men and women. So I would say that we don't have reason to believe that the findings are different. It just happens that the data sets I've been closest to tend to have more women. Also, women weren't studied for a long time, so I feel like it's okay if we spend a little extra time on them.
I think there was another question down here, same place? Oh, okay, over here, yes, in the middle.
How do you account for or normalize for disparities in financial resources among the people in the study?
It's a great question, and it matters a lot. So we always take account of a variety of factors related to financial resources, including educational attainment, income. Often we have wealth. There are a number of studies that actually characterize people's wealth, and you can account for that as well. We've also been interested in looking, we also know that financial and other socioeconomic resources pattern out some of these things, right? So folks who are more optimistic actually routinely have more education. Education is one of the strongest predictors of being optimistic. In fact, when people say, oh, isn't it heritable and determined by genetics, it's by far more strongly determined by levels of education, actually. And I think that's because being able to look forward in the future and expect good things is partly because you are confident you're going to be able to problem solve. And education gives you the tools for problem solving. So not only is it, we do know that these factors precede and predict levels of education, levels of optimism and purpose and so forth. But we've also done a look where we've tried to say, okay, well, if I look at people who have fewer resources, among the people who have fewer resources, do those who have higher levels of optimism still do better? And we also find that that is the case. Now, there's still some issues with that to the earlier point, correlation, not causation. Are the people with fewer resources who manage to be optimistic just different in some important way? They might be. We can't guarantee that that that's not what's driving it. But at least for the moment, the evidence is suggestive that even if you have fewer resources, if you're able to find a way to experience hope and optimism and so forth, you will be better off.
We have a question over here. Yes.
Hi. Oh, hi. I wrote this down so that I wouldn't ramble, but it still might be a little long-winded. I apologize. I also don't intend for this to be a loaded question, but alas. Knowing what we know about specifically optimism and its impact on health span, could you predict there to be an effect on this, considering that current generations are arguably living in a country where it's seemingly harder and harder to be optimistic?
So is the question, do I think that there will be shorter-lived people because there's lower levels of optimism?
Not necessarily shorter-lived, but health span being like...
I see.
Yeah.
It's a concern, right? Rates of mental health in youth mental health problems in youth is, substantial, and this has definitely been... It's a different area of my work, but something we've been extremely concerned about and trying to understand, what are the conditions we need to put into place to enable young people to have a sense of hope, an ability to look forward, and to feel like there's, something, that they're headed towards. So, I do think that that's going to show up in rates of chronic disease, actually, if we can't figure out a way to address it. But for whatever it's worth, there are many, many people in public health who are significantly concerned. Significantly concerned about these trends. They are definitely on the radar. Whether we're able to do something about it immediately, I can't say, but it is something that people are thinking really hard about. And this is actually part of the thing about the prosociality, right? Is like, in some ways, this is a very, and nature, right? These are actionable things, right? You can change policies. You don't have to get, to do income redistribution, which is a really heavy lift, right? But, if you can change some policies to make it easier for people to volunteer, like that seems more doable. So we are thinking about those, and I would agree. I think it's a serious, serious concern.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. I was wondering if you looked into the difference between people who have a faith community, perhaps go to church, and those who don't.
So I have not done that work myself, but there are definitely people who have looked at it. And it does seem to be the case that folks who are more religiously involved tend to have better health. When they try to understand what's the active ingredient, for what seems to matter the most, it does seem to be the social component. So people who belong to a religious group, have kind of a more built-in social place for belonging and opportunities for socializing and so forth. So when they've tried to look at, is it the prayer component or the social component, usually it's the social component that seems to come up more strongly. So one of the things we've thought about is like, well, I mean, you can't tell people they should go be religious, right? That's not usually actionable. It is certainly one of the benefits, though, and if you can think of other ways to help people to be socially involved, I mean, we did used to have more social groups, right? We had like the Lions Club, and we had all these different ways, and it's a challenge right now, right? And there's lots of questions about social media and sort of all the remote work and the ways in which people are less out in the world. I mean, I also think the religious involvement, because it gets people out of the house, right, and into another environment, and actually there is a big emphasis on giving time, right, and volunteering often in many of these communities, not always, but often. So I think there's a lot about it that is health beneficial, and certainly the research suggests, on average, that it is good for people's health.
Well, I hate to draw this to a close, but I think we have reached the point. I don't know about you, but I have to go home and walk my dog in the woods. So he's waiting for me.
Highly recommended.
I want to thank Dr. Kubansky for being our 2026 Thewlis Lecturer and our 20th anniversary, and I especially want to thank you all for coming out this evening. I hope everyone has learned something that you can take away and put to use in enhancing your longevity and your health. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.